Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. At 40 meters down, the ice is a deep, saturated cobalt. Compressed under millennia of its own weight, its crystal structure reorganizes until it absorbs every wavelength of light except blue. 15 Antarctic seasons in, I still noticed it every time I cut into a new layer. Something about that color made the ice feel like a material unto itself, dense with trapped time. February 9th, 3 weeks from mandatory seasonal evacuation. I was kneeling at the bottom of an excavation trench in the Transantarctic Mountains, 200 kilometers inland from McMurdo Station, brushing frost crystals off a wall section while Kevin Marsh ran the rotary drill above me. The trench rose 40 meters on both sides, compressed blue ice climbing to a bright slot of sky, 4 meters across at the bottom, 6 at the rim. We'd spent 6 weeks cutting it, hauling blocks with a cable rig, bracing the walls with aluminum supports every few meters. My site, my career's last good bet. I'd burned 2 full grant cycles from the National Science Foundation to get here, pitching the project on satellite thermal data that showed persistent heat at this depth. Heat buried in ice deposited roughly 40,000 years ago during the Upper Pleistocene. The models pointed to volcanic intrusion, a geothermal pocket that could reshape regional ice sheet stability predictions. Safe, fundable, exactly the work that could anchor a 44-year-old glaciologist's reputation after a divorce and a decade of diminishing returns. Kevin's drill whined from the scaffold platform above me. He was 32, a field tech out of Boulder, thin and strong, the kind of person who ran mountain trails on his days off and came back irritated if the weather had made the run too easy. He had a habit of wearing earbuds under his hard hat that I'd stopped trying to correct. That morning, while we were checking the cable rig, he'd made Craig guess a song by humming 4 tuneless bars into the wind. Craig had said, "If Kevin loses his hearing before 40, at least it'll be to better music than the drill motors." Kevin had grinned and turned the volume down exactly 1 notch. "Resistance just changed," Kevin called down. "I'm getting surface contact, something solid." I climbed the ladder to his platform. The drill bit had stalled against a surface that reflected our headlamps differently than ice or rock. Kevin backed the bit out, and I leaned in with a brush. Under a thin crust of frost, something dark and smooth caught the light. Metal, dense and dark, with a surface texture I'd never seen in geology samples or volcanic ejecta. Fine, repeating patterns covered it, etched into tight spiraling rows. They looked like circuit board traces pressed into an alloy that belonged in no catalogue I knew. "That's not basalt," Kevin said. "No." I pulled off my outer glove and pressed my bare fingertip against the surface. It was warm. At 40 meters below glacier surface, in ice that should have been minus 30 Celsius at this stratum, the metal was warm to the touch. We switched from the drill to hand tools, chisels, brushes, the smaller picks from the sample kit. Kevin worked from the platform. I worked below. We cleared ice centimeter by centimeter from an object that grew larger and stranger with every pass. The dark metal extended in both directions, wider than the trench wall we'd exposed. I called Craig Foster on the radio. Craig was 41, my logistics coordinator, and the closest thing I had to a friend on the crew. We'd met 9 years earlier on a storm-delayed resupply run when he found me trying to repair a frozen pump with the wrong wrench and bare hands. He'd handed me the right tool and stood between me and the wind until my fingers worked again. Since then, he had saved my field seasons in ways that never appeared in grant reports. He tracked fuel inventories, weather windows, batteries, bolts. Every small thing I forgot mattered until it broke or saved us. I told him to bring the lighting rig down and another set of hand tools. I did not yet understand that we were looking at something that belonged inside neither a glacier nor Antarctica. Over the next 2 hours, Craig held the lights while Kevin and I chipped away at the ice surrounding the artifact. He waited for the data to become ugly enough that questions could no longer make it worse. That was one of the things I trusted about him. The shape that emerged was roughly the size of a human ribcage, irregular but clearly manufactured, built from the same dark alloy. Through gaps in the casing, I could see layered internal discs tilted at different angles. The etched patterns covered every exterior face, spiraling inward toward a central seam that ran the object's full length. Through that seam, a pale, steady light was visible, dim and constant, like something inside had been incandescent for a very long time. Then Kevin cleared ice from below the artifact, and the shape of a hand emerged. A massive hand. Thick fingers, short and powerful, curled around the base of the device. A wrist, then the forearm, then the shoulder. I moved laterally along the trench wall, chipping faster, the brush abandoned. The curve of ribs appeared, then a barrel chest, heavy and wide. The body was pressed against the device, torso wrapped around it, as though protecting it or carrying it against the chest. Craig brought the light in tighter, and I cleared the last ice from the skull. The brow ridge told me first. A thick bar of bone above the eye sockets, heavier than any modern human skull would carry. The cranial vault was low and long, wider at the back than at the top. The jaw was broad and chinless, the cheekbones massive enough to cast their own shadows under the lamp. I didn't need a physical anthropologist. I'd grown up reading National Geographic. The proportions were unmistakable. A Neanderthal preserved in 40,000-year-old Antarctic ice, gripping a machine that no civilization on Earth could have built. I stood in the trench for a full 2 minutes before I raised the radio. Surface team, this is Harwood. We have a hominid body at depth, associated with an artifact of unknown origin. I need full documentation protocols and a direct line to McMurdo. This is a priority find. Craig stood beside me in silence. The light aimed at the skull, staring at the brow ridge as though waiting for the face to resolve into something plausible. The face held. Kevin was still on the platform above us when he pulled off his work glove and flexed his hand. "Fingers are killing me," he said. "Stiff. Must be the cold." I glanced up. He was rubbing the back of his right hand with his left. The exposed skin was mottled with brownish marks, the texture loose and slack. Kevin was 32. That hand looked like it belonged to a man past 60. I almost said something. Then I noticed the ice. The trench walls, in a ring extending roughly 3 meters outward from the body and the device, were receding. The solid ice was converting directly to vapor, the walls pulling away from the find in every direction. Thin curls rose under the lamplight. I noted it, logged it mentally as consistent with the thermal anomaly. A localized heat source would cause sublimation in surrounding ice. That was the first mistake I recognized as a measurement instead of a warning. The ring was growing fast enough to see. The walls retreated in real time, centimeter by centimeter, each minute widening the gap. "Kevin," I said, "take your hat off." He looked at me oddly, then pulled away the hard hat and wool liner. Under the trench lights, the hair at his temples had gone white, a hard, colorless white, pushing back from both sides into what had been solid brown hair that morning. Craig saw it at the same time I did. Through the gaps in the device's casing, the layered discs were turning. The movement was slow enough that I had to stare for several seconds to confirm it, each disc rotating on a different axis at a different speed. After 40,000 years sealed in ice, something inside the machine was active. "Everybody up," I said. "Up the ladder, now." Craig went first. Kevin followed, and I watched him climb. His movements were careful, his joints stiff. Each rung cost him visible effort. Halfway up, he paused to adjust his grip, and I could see the tendons standing out in his neck, tight underskin that looked thinner than it should have been. At the surface, in full daylight, Kevin's face confirmed what the trench light had suggested. Lines bracketed his mouth. The skin around his eyes had loosened, fine wrinkles webbing outward from the corners. He looked like a photograph aged by forensic software. The bones the same, but the tissue draped differently over them. Dr. Alan Priest, our team physician, was already walking over from the medical module. Priest was 55, a quiet man from Vermont who'd been doing Antarctic field medicine for 20 years. He took one look at Kevin's face and steered him by the elbow toward the medical tent. I stood at the lip of the trench, looking down. The blue ice of the chamber walls was pulling back from the find in real time, the sublimation ring wider than it had been 5 minutes ago. The dark shape of the device sat at the center of a growing pocket of clear air, the pale light from its central seam visible even at this distance. Below, a new sound rose from the trench, low, grinding like a millstone turning slowly on dry grain, the sound of something working. Priest examined Kevin in the medical module while I briefed the rest of the team in the main shelter. 9 of us total at Site 14. I kept the briefing factual. We'd found a preserved hominid with an associated artifact at target depth. A localized energy effect appeared to be associated with the find. Kevin had experienced physical symptoms from proximity exposure. Nobody was to approach the trench until further notice. I set a safety perimeter at 30 meters from the trench lip. The room stayed quiet after I finished. The team looked at me because I was the reason we were there, and for the first time all season, I understood that my sight meant something different to them than it did to me. What I didn't tell them was what Priest told me on the radio 20 minutes later. Kevin's field diagnostics showed joint cartilage degradation consistent with advanced osteoarthritis. His ocular lenses were developing opacity. Skin elasticity had dropped sharply, though Priest didn't have the equipment to pin down the number. He estimated 20 years of aging or more, heart rate irregular, blood oxygen dropping. His blood pressure looks like my father's, Priest said. My father is 81. I asked if there was treatment. For old age? Priest's tone carried the answer. I ordered insulated panels dragged over the trench opening, heavy composite sheets, meant for emergency shelter construction, rated for wind loads and thermal insulation. 2 men from the surface crew hauled them into position, working at the trench lip to lower them flat across the opening. Brian Perry, a 28-year-old field hand from Ohio, leaned over the edge to anchor the last panel and stayed within the trench's airspace for under 2 minutes. When he straightened up and pulled back his sleeve to check his watch, the skin on his forearms had changed. It was thinner, marked with brown spots that hadn't been there, the texture of someone approaching 40. He stared at his own arm, pushed the sleeve higher, and found the same damage above the elbow. Get back from the edge, I told him. Stay behind the perimeter. Brian walked away from the trench, turning his forearm in the light, running his thumb over skin that had been smooth and young an hour ago. Kevin died at 6:42 that evening. Priest gave me the clinical summary in person, standing outside the medical module with the door closed behind him. Multi-organ failure, starting with the kidneys and moving to the heart. Each system had declined along the trajectory of natural aging, compressed into hours. Kevin's body on the cot was unrecognizable. The frame was the same, but everything covering it had changed. His skin was translucent, spotted, stretched over brittle bones. His hair was white. His lips had thinned to a pale line. He looked 90. He'd been awake 15 minutes before the end, flexing his swollen hands, asking if the stiffness would pass. Priest had removed Kevin's earbuds and set them on the metal tray beside the cot. They looked obscene there, small and ordinary and bright. I sat in the main shelter with my laptop and a coffee that went cold, plotting the numbers. Kevin's exposure time, his distance from the device, the rate of observable change. I mapped what I knew onto a rough decay curve. Intensity dropped with distance from the artifact, but the fall-off wasn't steep enough to make any proximity safe for meaningful duration. I estimated that at the current inner field boundary, 3 meters from the device, unshielded exposure would be lethal in 15 to 20 minutes. At the trench lip, 40 meters from the artifact with partial ice shielding, exposure produced measurable aging within 2 minutes. Craig came in while I was running calculations. He'd spent the last hour wrapping Kevin's body in a sleeping bag and securing it outside in a cargo container. He sat across the table from me and watched me type for a while. "What are you doing?" "Modeling the exposure gradient. If we understand the fall-off rate, we can calculate safe working distances for containment." "Kevin died 3 hours ago, Dan." I stopped typing. Craig's face was careful and very tired. He wasn't accusing me of anything. He was just saying what was true. "I know," I said. The cursor blinked at the end of a column of numbers. I kept my attention on the screen and away from the medical module. Questions about Kevin's face when they zipped the sleeping bag closed had no operational value. Craig nodded once and left. I went back to the numbers. The numbers were the part I could do something about. Everything else was weather. That night we tried to smother the device. Craig organized the operation on my specifications. We ran hoses from the camp water supply, lowered them into the trench through a gap in the panels, and pumped water onto and around the artifact. In the sub-zero air, the water froze on contact. We layered ice over the find for 2 hours, trying to rebuild the thermal buffer the excavation had stripped away. By morning, the ice within the inner field radius had sublimated. The water we'd pumped in was gone, converted to vapor, and the chamber around the artifact was wider than it had been the night before. The device had consumed everything we'd fed it. I reached McMurdo Station on the satellite phone during a brief window of atmospheric clarity. I reported 1 fatality, requested emergency helicopter evacuation, and described the artifact in terms I thought might trigger a military response. McMurdo's operations coordinator heard me out, asked clarifying questions, and then told me what I already half expected. The storm system covering the interior was too extensive. Helicopters were grounded for a minimum of 36 hours and possibly longer. They could dispatch a tracked vehicle, but the route in current conditions would take over 20 hours, and sections of it might be impassable. "Can you shelter in place?" the coordinator asked. I looked out the window of the main shelter at the glacier surface. Between the camp and the trench, 400 meters of ice stretched flat and white under a grey sky. The covering panels over the trench were sagging inward. Beneath them, the sublimation void was expanding. The grinding sound from the device carried through the wind, audible even at this distance, the pitch slightly higher than the day before. "For now," I said. After the call, I ran the structural calculations I'd been avoiding. The ice beneath our camp was compressed glacial mass, millions of tons of it, held together by internal pressure and continuity. Voids destroy continuity. The sublimation zone spreading from the artifact was creating a hollow that weakened everything above it. If the void grew large enough, the surface ice would fracture and collapse into it, carrying the camp down. At the current rate, I estimated 48 hours before the fractures reached critical propagation. If the sublimation accelerated, and my measurements suggested it was already accelerating, the window could be 30 hours, less than that. I told Craig and Priest. Priest took it the way he took most bad news, with a long silence and a practical question. "How certain are you?" "I've been studying ice mechanics for 15 years, I said. "The math isn't ambiguous." Craig asked how long before the perimeter needed to move. I said it already did. Grey light spread across the glacier while I sent a GoPro camera into the trench, duct-taped to a 4-meter survey rod for orientation, and lowered on a cable from a remote pulley at the lip. I sat 40 meters above and 200 meters back from the trench lip, watching the real-time feed on a tablet screen while the wind tore at my jacket. What the camera showed reorganized everything I thought I understood. At first, my mind refused the image. The tablet showed blue ice, steam, the crescent edge of the collapsed panel, and the pale central glow of the artifact. Then the camera angle shifted, and the body appeared whole in the frame. The sublimation had opened the chamber into a vault. The Neanderthal and the device stood free of ice in a space roughly 10 meters across and 6 meters high, surrounded by retreating blue walls that steamed with vapor. The body was fully exposed now, upright and mid-stride. It was walking, one leg forward, one back. The torso leaned into the direction of travel, the hips rotated, the massive shoulders angled with the momentum of a step that had been frozen 40,000 years ago. The body was heading south. The posture was unmistakable. This was a person in motion, carrying something heavy, pressing forward into resistance. I remember the wind striking the hood of my parka. I remember the ache in my knees from sitting too long on the ice. For several seconds, those ordinary sensations seemed indecent. My body was warm, living, temporary. On the screen, another body had held a single step since before language had names for this continent. The hands had grown into the device. The camera's zoom showed the transition clearly. Skin into bone, bone into metal, the skeleton wrapped around and penetrating the dark alloy the same way a tree root grows into a crevice in stone. The fusion was biological. The Neanderthal's skeleton and the machine had become a single object. The asymmetric aging was visible in brutal clarity. The half of the body pressed against the device could have been a recently frozen specimen. Intact skin, visible veins beneath the surface, moisture crystals on the eyelashes of the closed left eye. The half facing outward was ruined, desiccated, white-haired, skin cracked and papery, joints swollen, the exposed right eye socket dark and sunken. One side of the body had been preserved, the other had aged centuries. Aging was the wrong word, I realized. The field looked like aging when it passed through flesh. In metal, it produced corrosion. In ice, sublimation. In bone, brittleness, fusion, and mineral change. Whatever the machine emitted was transition enforced. Matter pushed along whatever path it was already most willing to take. I watched the footage 3 times, then reviewed the sublimation data I'd been logging since the discovery. The ice was receding unevenly. The southern wall of the vault was pulling back faster than any other face. The floor was dropping, deepening toward the south. The field the device projected was elongated, stretched along the same heading as the Neanderthal's body. South and down. I went back to the thermal survey data from the original site assessment, the readings I'd used to justify the grant. I'd flagged the anomaly at our excavation depth and dismissed everything below it as geothermal background noise. Now I looked at the background noise with different questions. The deep readings formed a buried continuity, faint but directional, extending south beneath the ice sheet toward the continental interior. A corridor, perhaps, or the edge of something too large for my survey grid to frame properly. Something warm under a continent built out of cold. I found Craig and Priest in the main shelter and showed them everything. The camera footage, the sublimation data, the deep thermal readings. I walked them through what it meant. The Neanderthal hadn't found the device. It had been carrying it. Walking south through Antarctic ice fused to a machine that preserved the flesh touching it and destroyed everything else, consuming the ice ahead and leaving a tunnel that refroze behind. 40,000 years ago, the cold had finally overtaken the body. The ice had sealed around both of them, and the forward march had stalled. But the device had continued sublimating ice along its heading at a rate too slow to measure across human lifetimes. My excavation hadn't activated anything. It had removed the last meters of ice that were still absorbing the field. The device was in transit. It had been in transit since before agriculture or writing existed, and whatever it was travelling toward was south and below us, something large. For a moment, nobody spoke. The wind moved around the shelter walls. A spoon rattled in somebody's abandoned mug. I had come to Antarctica to find heat inside old ice. I had found a journey instead, and cut open the road. Craig listened to all of it. Then he said what he'd been trying to say since Kevin died. We leave, right now, on foot, in the storm, toward McMurdo. We radio for the tracked vehicle to meet us halfway. If there's something larger under the ice, I said, and this thing is heading toward it, leaving might not be enough. Craig stood up. Kevin is dead in a cargo container. Brian can barely close his hands. The glacier is caving in under us, and you want to keep studying it. I want to understand the scope of what we're dealing with before we... You want to understand it because it's yours. You found it. It's your anomaly, your site, your career, and you can't walk away from it because walking away means you spent 15 years in this place for nothing. There were answers I could have given. Operational answers. Responsible-sounding answers. McMurdo was unreachable on foot in the storm. The tracked vehicle might never find us if visibility dropped further. An exposed device beneath a failing glacier could be a planetary risk. All of that would have been true. Craig was talking about the part underneath. A sound cut through the shelter walls. The grinding pitch from the trench jumped, a shift like a gear catching a new ratio, and the ground beneath us shuddered. I felt it through the floor and up through my boots into my knees. Outside, someone cried out. We ran into the wind. 200 meters away, the glacier surface around the trench had slumped. A section of ice the size of a tennis court had dropped half a meter, cracking along stress lines that radiated outward from the void below. One of the covering panels had disappeared into the hole. The others hung at angles over a gap that was visibly wider than it had been that morning. Vapour rose from the opening in thick columns that the wind shredded and carried south. Move the camp, I told Craig. Everything. 400 meters upslope. Now. It took 4 hours to haul shelter modules, fuel drums, medical supplies and equipment across glacier surface in a 30-knot crosswind with visibility dropping by the hour. Everybody worked. Brian Perry hauled gear with the rest of us, though he moved stiffly and kept stopping to straighten his back. He was 28. He looked like he was closing in on 40. The brown spots on his forearms had spread to his hands. At one point I saw him standing alone beside a cargo sled, trying to pull the zipper of his parka closed. His fingers would not hold the tab. He tried twice, then tucked the hand under his arm before anyone else could see. Priest saw anyway. So did I. Brian looked at me across the blowing snow. He didn't ask the question. His mouth tightened, and for a second, the face underneath the premature lines was exactly as young as it should have been. During a break in the hauling, Craig and I stood together between trips, watching the crew drag a fuel bladder upslope. "Are you keeping us here because there's a scientific reason?" Craig said. "Or because you can't stand to walk away from it?" "Both." "That's not an answer, Dan." "It's the true one." He looked towards the collapsed trench site. The depression was wider now, a shallow bowl in the glacier's surface that caught the blowing snow and funneled it downward. From this distance, the grinding sound was a continuous undertone beneath the wind. "At the current expansion rate," I said, "the edge of that depression reaches the new camp in about 30 hours. We either find a way to stop the device, or we march for McMurdo in storm conditions with an injured man and 2 days of portable rations." Craig pulled his hood tighter against the wind. "I know which one you're going to choose." I didn't answer. I picked up the tow handle of the cargo sled and started walking up slope. I spent the rest of that day and most of the night mapping the field. Temperature sensors on long cables, deployed at measured distances and angles from the trench, each one recording thermal change rates in the surrounding ice. I lowered them into shallow crevasses, hung them from survey poles, packed them into snow mounds at the perimeter. By midnight, I had enough data to render the field's shape in 3 dimensions on my laptop. It was ovoid. The long axis pointed south-southwest, angled roughly 30 degrees below horizontal, matching the Neanderthal's heading. Along that axis, the field expanded about 3 times faster than in any other direction. Intensity fell with distance but never reached 0 within any range I could measure. That last detail sat with me through the night. We'd been within a few hundred meters of the device for days. All of us. Sleeping, eating, working, breathing inside a gradient that aged organic matter. The exposure at this range was minor, the fall-off steep, but minor and absent are different things. Priest started checking the team at dawn. He worked through them one at a time in the medical module, using the limited diagnostics available. 2 more crew members showed early joint stiffness. One had developed a tremor in his right hand that hadn't been there a week ago. He found me afterward. "You should let me examine you too." "I already know." I showed him my forearm. 3 days earlier, I'd scraped the skin below my elbow on a bolt head while rigging the cable system. A minor cut. In the last 24 hours, the injury had cycled through weeks of healing. Scabbed, split, scabbed again, and scarred over. The scar tissue was white and smooth, the way a cut looks after months of recovery. 3 days. Priest studied it. Then, "How much time did that cost you?" "A few weeks, maybe a month." "And the others?" "The same or less. We've all been soaking in the edges of this thing since we uncovered it." Brian Perry moved through camp that morning like a man compensating for a body he no longer trusted. 28 years old. The face in his washroom mirror could have passed for 45. His knuckles had swollen, the joints thickening visibly. When he poured coffee, his hand shook with the tremor of failing motor control, and the mug rattled against the table when he set it down. He kept staring at the mug afterward, as though the sound had embarrassed him. "Does it stop when we get away from it?" he asked Priest. Priest looked at me before answering. He should not have had to. "We don't know," I said. Brian nodded once, not because he accepted the answer, but because there was no better one available. I gathered Craig and Priest in the main shelter and went through what was left. We could march for McMurdo, 20+ hours on foot across glacier terrain in storm conditions, with declining visibility, limited rations, and a man whose body was deteriorating. The tracked vehicle from McMurdo was somewhere en route, but we couldn't confirm its position. We could wait, while the glacier failed beneath us and the field aged all of us by the hour. Or someone could enter the field, approach the device, try to damage it or separate it from the body, and pay whatever it cost. I'd studied the field's interaction with inorganic materials. My instruments near the trench showed oxidation consistent with years of weathering compressed into hours, but dense metals attenuated the effect significantly. The aluminum panels from our living modules reduced field intensity by an estimated 60% based on the thermal sensor data. If someone wore layered metal shielding, aluminum cut from the module walls and bent into crude armor, the effect would slow enough to give them minutes inside the inner field. The field also pulsed. The pulses weren't regular enough to be safe, but they created troughs, brief windows where the intensity dipped before surging again. I could not stop what it did. I could only time a person's approach between the worst of it. "I'll go," I said. Craig shook his head before I finished the sentence. "No. Craig, you're the only person here who can calculate whether this glacier holds or collapses. You're the only one who can coordinate with McMurdo when the satellite window opens. If you die in that trench, the rest of us are stranded on failing ice with no structural geologist and no communication plan. And if you go, then you still have both those things." We looked at each other. He understood what he was doing, and so did I. He was protecting me from the part of myself that wanted to go down, because going down meant seeing the device at arm's length. Understanding it. He was removing the option, and I was letting him remove it. I could have argued harder. I could have ordered him to stay. I could have said the man responsible for opening the trench should be the one to enter it. Instead, I handed him the timing chart. He knew me well enough to save me from myself. I knew him well enough to let him. That permission was the worst thing I'd done since we arrived at the site. "The field has pulse patterns," I said. "Intensity drops in intervals. If you time your approach to a trough, you might gain an extra 40 or 50 seconds. Show me." We spent 2 hours cutting aluminum panels from the easternmost living module. Craig and I bent them by hand around a fuel drum, shaping a chest plate, arm guards and shin covers. We fashioned a helmet from a cooking pot reinforced with aluminum strips, with a gap cut for visibility. The armor was heavy and crude. Craig practiced walking in it across the snow. He looked absurd. Neither of us said so. At one point, while I was wiring a sensor pack to his chest plate, he looked down at my hands and said, "You'll remember that pump at Shackleton Basin. I remember you taking credit for fixing it. I remember you almost losing 3 fingers because you wouldn't ask for help. I tightened the strap until the buckle held. This is me asking," I said. Craig looked at me for a long second. Then he nodded. Priest watched the preparations from the medical module doorway with his hands in his pockets. Craig descended the ladder at 11:15 in the morning. The storm had eased enough to open a corridor of grey light above the trench, and the ice walls caught it and turned it blue. I monitored from a position 200 meters back from the lip, tracking field intensity on my instruments and pressing a handheld radio against my ear. The rest of the team waited at the relocated camp, 400 meters upslope. Priest had the radio on, in the medical module. Everyone else had been told to prepare for overland departure. Craig's voice came through with the compressed quality of a cheap transmitter. "I'm at the bottom. The last few rungs of the ladder are corroded, flaking under my gloves." "Copy. Temperature?" "Warmer than it should be. I can feel the heat through the suit. The air down here is 10-15 degrees above surface." A pause. "The chamber's expanded since the camera footage. The void extends back at least 15 meters on the south side. I can see the body. Distance? 20 meters, starting my approach." I watched the field intensity data on my laptop. The sensors nearest the trench spiked and dipped in uneven intervals, the pulse pattern I'd mapped the night before. I waited for a trough. "Now, Craig, move." His breathing came through the radio, steady, the aluminum plates knocking together with each stride. At 15 meters, he said, "I can feel it, my knees, like I've been kneeling on concrete all day." A pause. "The body is bigger than the camera showed. The shoulders are wider than mine." At 12 meters, legs are stiffening, hard to keep pace. His voice had shifted, rougher, the words arriving with more air behind them. He sounded like a man who'd been speaking too long in the cold, voice worn down to its lower registers. At 8 meters, "Dan," the hands. Each word carried a weight it hadn't carried a minute ago. His voice had dropped again, the consonants losing precision. "You can see where the bone enters the metal. The marrow channel continues into the alloy. The inside surface of the metal has the same texture as the inside of a long bone. How are you feeling?" "Old." Something that might have been a laugh or a cough. "I'm going to try to separate them." He reached the device and went to work with a pry bar. I listened to metal scrape on metal through the radio, to effort sounds, to breathing that grew heavier by the minute. The armor reduced the field but couldn't stop it. I tracked what it was doing to him by the changing grain of his voice. "It won't move." Slower now, each word spaced by effort. "The fusion goes centimeters into the metal. I'd need a surgical saw, and even then the alloy would break the blade. Dan, this is one piece." The skeleton grew into the machine. "Craig, come back." "Wait." Scraping. "The seam. Down the center. I'm going to try to get a tool into it." Metal rang against metal, a thin sound that carried up through the ice vault and across the glacier to where I sat. On my instruments, the field intensity spiked, then settled. "I've got it open a few millimeters." His voice had thinned, each word formed with more breath than force. "There's something inside. A component. Central. Size of a fist. It's the source of the light." "Describe it." "Dense. Surface catches light like a cut diamond, but the color's wrong." A long pause. His breathing was audible now, labored, the breathing of a man whose lungs were losing their capacity to stretch and fill. "Warm on my face. Like standing near a campfire. This thing has been burning inside this machine since before anyone built anything." Craig dropped the bar, walked back to the ladder, "Now." Silence. Then his voice again, thinner still, arriving one syllable at a time. "The aluminum on my left arm, corroded through. I can see my sleeve." Another pause. Can't curl my fingers around the bar. Leave it. Just walk. Dan. What came through the radio was the voice of a very old man, the consonants soft, the vowels stretched wide. Stop measuring. Start deciding. This thing doesn't care about your data. I pressed the radio to my ear. Static carried shallow breathing, the same sound I'd heard in Kevin's final hours. Then came a noise that might have been words, but the mouth and throat behind them had aged past language. Then silence. On the tablet beside my laptop, the camera feed showed the floor of the vault. Craig's shape lay at the base of the Neanderthal, the aluminum armor scattered around him in corroded strips. Two figures side by side in the ice chamber. One had been there for 40,000 years, the other for 40 minutes. I sat on the glacier with the radio in my hand and the wind pulling at me, and I did not go in. Craig was dead. Entering the field would kill me, and the team needed me for what came next. Every part of that reasoning was correct. It was the same reasoning that had put Craig in the trench while I watched from a safe distance with instruments and a laptop. Being right and being decent were two separate measurements, and I had always been better at one than the other. By the time I walked back to camp, I'd made my decision. 7 of us remained. Brian Perry sat in the corner of the main shelter, with his swollen hands wrapped around a mug that rattled when he tried to lift it. The others watched me with the expression of people who understood that whatever I said next would determine the week's survival. I kept it brief. The glacier above the excavation site was already failing. Fracture lines were propagating through the compressed mass above the trench, and collapse was inevitable. Uncontrolled, it might break around the void and leave the device exposed in a rubble field. But if I used the drilling equipment to weaken specific stress points in the upslope ice face, I could direct the failure. Channel millions of tons of compressed ice into the void, burying the device far deeper than it had been before my excavation found it. Under greater pressure, under more mass, I couldn't kill the device. I could add another 40,000 years of ice between it and the surface. The drilling had to happen at 4 points along the upslope face, all within a few hundred meters of the trench, inside the field's attenuation zone. The cost would be years of biological aging. Maybe a decade, maybe more. I couldn't pin the number down. Take the piston bully, I told them. Head for McMurdo. Priest has the satellite phone and the communication protocols. Radio for the tracked vehicle and coordinate a rendezvous. Priest stood. I should stay and... You can't calculate ice sheet stress failures. I need to place the boreholes within centimeters of the right fracture lines. If the angles are wrong, the collapse misses the void and the device ends up on the surface. This is my field. It has to be me. Brian Perry pushed himself up from his chair. I'm already aging. Let me handle the drill. You direct from a distance. I looked at him. He was genuine. His body was already committed to a slow version of Kevin's decline. The trajectory fixed since the moment he'd leaned over the trench lip. Letting him take the exposure would have been the kind of calculation I was built for. For 1 second, I made it. Then I looked at his hands. You don't know how to place the charges, Brian, I said. 1 bore hole misaligned by half a meter, and the whole collapse goes wrong. He sat down. There was nothing to argue with. I was right, and the specific cruelty of being right was that my expertise was the thing keeping me here. Priest's face had gone still. He looked older than he had that morning, though I did not know whether that was the field or only grief. They loaded the piston bully in 30 minutes. Fuel, rations, survival gear, medical supplies. Priest and I exchanged communication schedules. He would radio McMurdo once he was in range. He would report everything: the hominid, the device, the bone metal fusion, the field and its directional expansion, the deep thermal anomaly. He would make certain someone listened. Craig's name came up once. One of the younger crew asked if we should attempt to recover the body. I said no. Nobody pressed it. The piston bully pulled away at 2:15, its tracks cutting clean lines into the glacier surface. I watched it shrink against the white until it became a dark point trailing exhaust, then disappeared. The wind and the grinding from below were the only sounds left. I went to work. The drill rig was a portable rotary unit, heavy enough that I dragged it between positions on a cargo sled. First stress point, 210 meters from the trench lip, where a column of dense ice supported the overhang above the void. The borehole had to go 9 meters deep, angled at 40 degrees, intersecting the stratum at a precise depth. I drilled. The bit chewed through surface snow, then compacted fern, then solid blue ice. The motor whined, and the drill rod vibrated in my hands. For the first hour, I thought about angles, stress propagation, cable length, charge depth. Then my right knee began to hurt, cartilage thinning beneath bone, the joint losing its clean internal space. I shifted my weight and kept drilling. My fingers stiffened around the controls. When I flexed them, the knuckles resisted, swollen in the glove. At this distance, the field's effect was subtle. It took possession of ordinary sensations and moved them forward. A sore knee became damage, a stiff grip became loss. The afternoon passed, and my body spent months inside it. I finished the first borehole, packed the explosive charge, ran the detonation cable back toward my staging point, and dragged the drill to the second position. 4 stress points along the upslope face, each requiring a borehole and a packed charge. Each one deeper and closer to the trench than the last, because the critical columns were arranged in an arc around the upslope face, and the arc tightened as it approached the void. The third position was 140 meters from the trench. I could hear the grinding clearly there, a low tone that rose and fell in uneven intervals. The depression in the glacier surface was visible to my left, a broad, shallow bowl with fractures radiating from its center. The abandoned camp had partially slid into it. I could see the edge of a shelter module angled steeply inward, one wall broken, the rest disappearing into the sinkhole. My vision blurred while drilling the third hole. I stopped, blinked, wiped my eyes. The blur returned. I recognized the onset. Early lens opacity, the same condition Priest had found in Kevin's eyes, just milder. My body was aging around me while I worked, the field extracting years. I thought of Kevin's earbuds on the tray, Brian's hand failing on the zipper tab, Craig saying, "Stop measuring, start deciding." I finished the third hole, packed the charge, ran the cable, dragged the drill to position 4, 105 meters from the trench. This deep inside the gradient, the field stopped being subtle. My joints ached with the pain of cartilage thinning beneath bone. My grip strength had dropped enough that I needed both hands on the drill controls. When I pulled off my outer glove to check the charge placement, the hand I saw was spotted and slack-skinned, tendons standing in ridges, knuckles swollen. I set the fourth charge more by touch than by sight, my fingers too stiff for precision. I ran the last cable back to the staging point, 270 meters upslope, and wired all 4 detonation lines into the firing mechanism. The wind had dropped. The storm was breaking apart. I could see blue sky opening in the west, the first clear sky in days. McMurdo's atmospheric window was arriving. Below me, the glacier stretched toward the trench site, white and fractured. The grinding from the void was louder than it had been that morning. The depression had widened again. Fresh cracks radiated from its edges, splitting along the stress trajectories I'd mapped in my models. The collapse was coming whether I triggered it or not. All I was doing was telling it where to fall. I pressed the detonator, 4 sharp detonations muffled by 9 meters of ice above each charge. For a full second, nothing visible happened. Then the upslope face moved. The fracture began at the first borehole and raced along the stress lines faster than I could track, a crack propagating through the compressed ice with a sound like a rifle shot scaled to the size of a mountain. The overhang separated from the glacier body along the lines I'd cut, tilted, and dropped. I'd estimated the mass at 2 to 3 million tons. The estimate meant nothing against the reality. The entire upslope face sheared away and fell into the void in a single cascading sheet, carrying snow, surface material, and the wreckage of the abandoned camp down into the trench. The air compressed around me and released in a wave of pressure that knocked me sideways. I couldn't hear. I could only feel the glacier moving under my body, the ice reshaping itself in a single catastrophic adjustment. A secondary fracture opened 6 meters behind my position. I fell, crawled upslope, dragged myself on forearms and knees as the surface buckled. The section where I'd been standing dropped 2 meters and shattered. I cleared the edge by body lengths. The collapse lasted roughly 12 seconds. The main failure came first, followed by secondary fractures and a groaning resettlement that continued for another 15 minutes as the glacier found its new equilibrium. Millions of tons of ice filled the void, the trench, the chamber, the device, the Neanderthal, Craig, all of it buried under a mass that would take millennia to consume. The grinding sound was gone. The device was still running, I had no doubt about that. But the ice above it was absorbing the vibration before it could reach the surface, the way it had for 40,000 years before I cut into it. I lay on the glacier and looked at the sky. Clear blue, deepening toward evening. The storm was over. When I raised my hands, I saw the hands of a man decades older than me, spotted, loose-skinned, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. I touched my face and felt deep lines, sagging skin, the sharpened bones of an aging skull. I was 44 years old. My hands and my face belonged to someone past 70. The rescue team arrived the following morning. 2 tracked vehicles and a helicopter, scrambled after Priest's radio reports, reached McMurdo operations. They found me near the collapse zone, wrapped in a survival blanket from a scattered supply cache. The helicopter pilot told me later he'd assumed I was an elderly researcher who'd been stranded at the site for weeks. I told the rescue team what was under the ice. The hominid, the device, the bone-metal fusion, the field and its directional expansion, the deep thermal anomaly to the south. I told them the device was still running, that the collapse had brought centuries of containment, maybe more, but the containment and cessation were different things. The device had been burning through ice for 40,000 years before I found it. A few million additional tons was an obstacle on a journey that had already spanned 40 millennia. The rescue coordinator wrote things down. He was professional and thorough. When I asked for the incident number, he told me it would be assigned after review. 2 men in cold-weather gear collected my laptop, the tablet, the external drives, the sensor logs, and the camera rig. They labeled everything as field evidence and sealed it in grey transport cases without McMurdo markings. I never saw any of it again. They evacuated me to McMurdo, where a military flight carried me to Christchurch, then to a naval hospital in San Diego. In the weeks that followed, the collapse zone at Site 14 was reclassified. The official report attributed 2 fatalities, Kevin Marsh and Craig Foster, to a structural failure during a routine glaciology field season. The thermal anomaly data was archived. My medical records described an unspecified degenerative condition. Nobody published anything about a Neanderthal, or a device or a field that aged men to dust. I was 44 on paper. The body they medically retired belonged to a man past 70. They gave me a room at a military hospital in Bethesda and a wheelchair and a window facing a parking lot in Maryland. 6 months after the evacuation, I was sitting in the corridor outside physical therapy, scrolling through a news aggregator on a tablet. A short wire service piece in the science section caught my eye. A routine satellite survey of the trans-Antarctic mountains had detected a minor thermal anomaly at a site previously associated with a glacier collapse. The anomaly was small, consistent with residual geothermal activity. The article ran 4 paragraphs. No major outlet picked it up. I set the tablet on my knees and looked down the empty corridor. Rain streaked the windows. The hospital was quiet enough that I could hear it, or thought I could, or remembered it so clearly that the difference didn't matter. Stone against stone. The sound of something working through the dark, heading south. I'd dropped a mountain on it. buried it deeper than it had been before I found it. Craig was dead, and Kevin was dead, and I'd traded 30 years of my body for 12 seconds of collapsing ice, and none of it was enough. The device had been walking for 40,000 years. It had crossed kilometers beneath the glacier, millimeter by millimeter, and it would keep going, because whatever waited at the other end of its heading had been waiting longer than human memory, and could wait longer still. The only thing I had changed was the amount of myself it took with it.